Hello, I'm Ezekiel, and we're here to talk about what's going on with the globalization of the economy, America's trade situation, the Trump tariffs, and their global impact. So, what is globalization? Globalization, in the economic sense, means the system of international trade that breeds interalliance via its interconnectedness. This benefits countries by allowing greater access to goods they may not ordinarily have, and allows countries to take advantage of the different prices of goods and labor across countries. Globalization also has the major strategic drawback of causing over-reliance on foreign countries to sustain a country, thus providing them with leverage. Throughout history, there have been periods with increased amounts of globalization and others in which varying degrees of economic isolationism have been the norm, though some amount of trade has always occurred. The earliest known example of a very high degree of globalization is the Late Bronze Age, from about 1800 BC to 1200 BC, a period in which many goods such as tin, copper, glass, olive oil, craftsmen, and many forms of knowledge were exchanged between the nations of the Eastern Mediterranean and even further across the known world. The interconnectedness of economies in this period was a contributing factor in the abruptness and severity of the Bronze Age collapse, as when parts of the system faltered, the rest of the system came tumbling down. In contrast, an example of reduced globalization would be when mercantilism was the standard economic practice of European nations from the 16th to 18th centuries. The core tenets of this economic model were to increase the wealth of the nation by restricting imports while maximizing exports, accumulating precious metals, gold and silver, in the process. This model worked well if a country could produce everything it needed itself, and was the foundational reasoning for the large-scale use of tariffs. This means it favored large empires, because otherwise a country wouldn't have the resources to be self-sufficient. It did, however, cause issues, such as the Corn Laws, which caused the price of grain to skyrocket, leading to famine and unrest in Great Britain as one example. Europe started to shift away from mercantilism from the 19th century onwards because in certain areas trade just made more sense financially for both parties. For example, if Britain wants port and Britain's ally Portugal wants wool, simply makes more sense to allow trade to occur, as Britain does not produce port and Portugal does not produce sufficient wool. Despite mercantilism not being enforced as fiscal policy so ruthlessly across Europe, it was still present in many forms up until the Second World War, the best example of which would be the British Empire's system of preferential trade, which gave tariff advantages to trade within the British Empire. Post-World War II, America and the Soviet Union worked together to dismantle what was left of the European colonial empires, and each tried to fill as much of the vacuum this created as possible by imposing their own respective economic systems on the now post-colonial world. Europe, without its empires, was also divided between the American and Soviet economic systems. The American system was a form of globalization that America was able to dominate primarily because all the other developed nations at the time had just had their industrial bases ravaged by the war, and because of the imposition of the dollar as the new reserve currency. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the American system was able to claim victory and was able to impose itself on almost all the rest of the world that it had previously been unable to do so, leaving only a few holdouts against it that, aside from China, were mostly irrelevant. It was the belief of the Americans that China too could be integrated into this global economic system that America sat atop. The way they believed they could make this happen was via investing in the Chinese economy in such a way to create a business class whose profit incentives would be to oppose the Chinese Communist Party in pushing for further liberalization of the economy, whilst making China more interconnected and thus dependent on the rest of the world. This strategy appeared to be working somewhat, making slow progress at least during the 80s and 90s, in particular when China was ruled by Deng Xiaoping, who did open the country's economy a fair bit with his many reforms. However, since then the Chinese Communist Party has clearly established that they ultimately control the economy, and has made an example of Chinese businessmen that have attempted to push for further reforms, such as billionaire Jack Ma. This leads us to America's current problem. America has for quite some time been living beyond its means. funding an overstretched empire abroad and an expansive welfare state at home, while its elite has concentrated as much of the remaining wealth as possible in its own hands. America has been able to live beyond its means because it possesses the global reserve currency. Because countries want dollars in order to conduct trade with one another, there is massive global demand for dollars. This has allowed America to offshore its manufacturing and simply print mass amounts of dollars, which it then essentially exports in exchange for manufactured goods. This system means America runs a trade deficit, which isn't inherently a bad thing. However, America's trade deficit has ballooned by almost 40% over the last 5 years to $1.2 trillion, an amount that is unsustainable and in dire need of reining in. The other major consequence has been manufacturing. The American elite does not seem to care for the most part as to whether or not blue-collar Americans can get decent manufacturing jobs and lead decent lives, but what the military and governmental factions of this elite do care about is their ability to wage war. If America cannot make jets and missiles without components made in other countries that may even be hostile to America, it cannot effectively wage war, meaning that at the very least, these production chains need to be reshored either in America or in countries whose loyalty to America is unquestionable. Essentially, what the Trump administration is attempting to avoid is winding up in a similar situation to modern Britain, which, since the Second World War, has deindustrialized to the point that it now has the lowest manufacturing base of any of the G7 countries, and in turn, overly financialized its economy, making Britain overly reliant on imports to function and putting it at the mercy of macroeconomic trends as to whether or not it can reasonably afford these imports. This vulnerability to global supply chain disruptions was made painfully clear during the 2022 energy crisis in Europe. Previous American governments have acknowledged these growing problems to various degrees, but their attempts at solving them have typically amounted to sending trade delegations to the World Trade Organization to ask nicely about mediating and adjusting America's trade, which hasn't really achieved anything of note. Trump, on the other hand, has advocated for the use of tariffs against foreign countries to regulate trade and retaliate to hostility since the 1980s, long before his political career, so it comes as no surprise that he is now attempting to utilize tariffs in order to solve America's trade deficit and manufacturing issues. Tariffs are simply a tax on imports. They simultaneously raise money and make it harder to import, thus helping with the deficit situation while incentivizing production to move to where it will no longer have to suffer the tariffs, meaning either move to America or to a friendly country that America has not implemented harsh tariffs on. Implementing high tariffs across the board is a negotiation strategy. If America had gone to each country it wanted to renegotiate trade with and asked for a better deal, those countries would have had the upper hand because America is the one asking. What Trump has done has caused most countries to ask America what they can do to relieve the tariffs that have been placed upon them, while making it clear which countries are happy to position themselves against America by ignoring the tariffs and simply trading with other markets, such as China. China, through its refusal to be integrated into the American-led globalized economy, has been able to provide an alternative option to America, which has been able to foster the growth of an entire trading bloc that exists in opposition to America and the West, the core of which is the BRICS countries, which, if you want to know more about, you should watch my previous video. This emerging divide in international trade has the potential to reshape the global economy away from globalization back towards more divided and mercantile economic spheres. Globalization will still exist to some degree, especially within the Western world, but any country that does not wish to be economically bullied by America and that isn't overly reliant on America will now be more inclined to consider simply trading with China and the other BRICS countries. Neither China nor America want to totally decouple their economies overnight, as that would cause a great deal of turmoil, but both are firmly moving in the direction of decoupling eventually. It would be more accurate to say that rather than globalization ending, the global economy is bifurcating into two separate economic spheres, an American Western sphere and a China BRICS sphere. America's position is certainly in decline, as most of the world already does more trade with China than with America. However, America is particularly in trouble, as regions such as Europe, which are assumed to be in America's sphere of influence, are even now starting to pull away. Though Western Europe still trades more with America, much of Eastern Europe already does more trade with China. The Trump administration does not view Europe as pulling its weight internationally, which, though true, this rhetoric serves only to alienate Europe. America does not want to lose European trade partners, but is struggling to offer better deals than China can, which will lead to further division on the continent, as there is little to no comprehensive strategy from Europe on how to navigate the situation. Though Trump's tariffs ought to force the manufacturing of strategically important goods such as military components and computer chips, as demonstrated by massive investment into Intel's Arizona chip plant, back to America, the chances of reshoring much more than that are very limited, as there is little incentive to do so. American iPhones will simply be made in India instead of China. America's trade deficit situation will be improved more than it was by any previous administration, but only time will tell as to whether or not it is enough. What is for sure is that we should expect the trade war to continue and to escalate, as neither China nor America are showing any signs of reversing course, and both are set on the trajectory of economic bifurcation and multipolarity. If you liked this video, please appease the algorithm by liking, commenting, and subscribing, as there's more in the works. Thank you, and goodbye.